Okay, I see that people are starting to trickle in. I'm going to wait to kind of officially start until it looks like we've reached reached kind of close to our total numbers, and then we'll get started. So just bear with us for a minute or two. Okay, looks like the numbers have slowed down a little bit. So we will get started. I'm Peter Beinart. I'm really thrilled to be joined for this conversation. Someone's already raised their hand. People are very eager. For this conversation with two journalists whose work I profoundly admire. Orly, who is an editor at Local Call and the chair of the board of B'Tselem, and also a translator of Farsi literature into Hebrew, and Mairav Zonszein, a journalist and a senior analyst at the International Crisis Group for Israel-Palestine. You're welcome to talk amongst yourselves in the chat, but I'm not going to be looking at the chat. I will be looking at the Q&A, however. So if you do have questions, I'll ask some questions to start, and then I'll start to incorporate some of the questions from the audience into the chat. It already feels some ways a little bit like a lifetime since we sent out the link to this event back on Sunday. But I think there's still some really big questions about what has happened that need exploration. And so I'm going to start by asking Mairav one big question, which is about why this coalition government was so intent on judicial reform or judicial overhaul or judicial coup or whatever you want to call it, why they were so intent on it in the first place. What does it signify to different parts of this coalition, and what was it a means for them to do?
Hi, Peter. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. So it's a very good question because they've kind of come out with such full force to do this judicial overhaul that it really beckons the question, why now? I think that one of the most important things to keep in mind about why this is happening now is, first of all, because Netanyahu came back after being ousted, which was, extremely hurtful to him as in his ego. And we had a government that was considered by many Israelis and possibly the world as a leftist type of government. Of course, that's not the case at all. But I think that's something that hurt all the people who are now in power. And so there's an element of coming back full force. The other thing that's really, I think, important is that all of the parties in this government have a greater Israel annexationist agenda, not just the far-right national settlers, the Likud. The Justice Minister, Yariv Levin, you can find a video of him talking over 10 years ago about how the biggest impediment to annexing the West Bank is the High Court. So this is something that has been on his mind for a long time. It's not something that just Ben Gvir and Smotrich are interested in. This is something that has become more and more of a consensus, not only on the Israeli right, but on the Israeli center and center-right as well. So the judicial overhaul is first and foremost a way to get the court out of the way. We don't want to deal with them. We don't want to deal with the rule of law. We want to do what we want. And that, of course, pertains also to the ultra-Orthodox, who have several interests in this plan. And the primary one is the exemption of the military draft, something that the Supreme Court struck down in 2017 on the basis of it being unequal to allow such a huge population to just simply not serve in order to study Jewish law. And this is something that they have wanted to pass for a long time. So these are all the major interests of the parties in this group, in the coalition. And I think now that they have this majority that they didn't really have before, I mean, Netanyahu has always worked with moderates, a bit to his left. Today, he has a very, very far-right homogenous government. And I think that the people who are the most determined, like Simcha Rotman from Religious Zionism, who's heading the legislative committee, and Yariv Levin and a few others, they're like, this is our chance. But of course, if you ask me, they could have done it in a much more strategic way. They could have done it much slower, much quieter, and it would have been more effective. And I think they really, really did not calculate how the protest would be, which I'm sure we'll get into in a minute. And of course, lastly, which is what everyone thinks is the main reason, is that Netanyahu is on trial and he wants to evade his trial. Now, I think that is certainly a big part of it, but I don't think that that's the whole story. I don't think the people in his coalition care that much whether he, whether he goes to jail or not. I mean, some of them would be more than happy for him to go to jail. So that's not, it's not in their interest to do that. But those are all the reasons.
Before I go to Orly, Mairav, I just want to follow up on one thing. I think one of the things that's been confusing for some people on the left and for people who think about Palestinian rights is that it doesn't really seem that from the scholarly work that I've seen and from B'Tselem's work that the Supreme Court really has prevented the Israeli government from doing almost everything it wants vis-a-vis Palestinians in the West Bank. So help me understand why a court that actually seems like it's been so deferential to Israel trampling the rights of Palestinians in the occupied territories is seen by this government as such an impediment.
Well, this is like the Israeli, mind fuck, excuse the term. It's just like what center is considered left in other places and it's completely right what you're saying. Now, the Supreme Court has made a few rulings, whether it's LGBTQ rights in the gay parade, whether it's you're not allowed to, set up a Jewish settlement on private Palestinian land. They have made a ruling like that. Of course, they've allowed settlements in many, many other cases and for other reasons. They are fine with the siege on Gaza. They're fine with shooting at live shots at unarmed protesters. I mean, you're right. They've just done so much to actually allow Israel to reach the point that it is today. But the people on the right still don't like it. It's still not enough for them. They want to take it even further. That's just their agenda. And they think that they're victims. When they were pulled out of Gaza, the people who were pulled out of Gaza, they believe that they were victims, that the Supreme Court didn't do anything for them. Now, this is, of course, wrong because the Supreme Court stepped in to give them reparations. So it's a fictitious narrative, but as far as they're concerned, it's still an obstacle.
Wonderful. Orly, so now to the protests. What were these protests in your mind really about?
Hi, Peter. Thank you so much for having me. I think they are really about turning back the clock. This is, in one short sentence, what the protesters really want. This is not to underestimate the sense of urgency. I mean, the Israeli public is horrified, is terrified by this judicial coup. You can hear it in, small talk is in the cafe. Everybody is preoccupied with that. Everybody is really frightened that Israel is going to turn into something else. But at this very crucial moment, and I think that not many societies get that chance, that opportunity to actually open up an honest conversation about how did we get to that point that a dictatorship is literally knocking on our doors. Instead of having that conversation, there is a sense that, some unidentified object from the sky just shot that, hit the wonderful Israeli democracy and shifted it from its course, and something very peculiar happened. And now we have to stop it physically with our bodies, pour out to the streets and demonstrate against it. But there is no, the main signs that you would see in these protests are for calling for democracy, calling for equality. But I think that the Israeli society never had this conversation about what democracy means. Did we have a democracy before that judicial coup? We were allowed to believe for so many years that you can be a democracy and hold an occupation, that you can be a democracy and practice apartheid regime, that part of the conversation is just not happening. And so basically what they want is really to turn the clock back to the moment before the current Netanyahu's government and before that march of extreme, really frightening legislation that they want to promote.
So is it too harsh to say that for many of the protesters, although they might not have vocalized it this way, what they really meant was that they were protesting to retain Israel as a liberal democracy for Jews?
Absolutely, absolutely. There is no other sense really for democracy when it comes to the majority of the Jewish public. This is how Israel defined democracy. I mean, the Jewish and democratic state has always been Jewish for the Palestinians and democratic for the Jews. So that's the deal, the equation that the masses want to go back to.
Mairav, I wanted to ask you about one particular part. I think one of the things that I was very struck by seeing the images of the women protesting, in the garb of the Handmaid's Tale, and I wondered how much of you believe the energy around the protests was about the Haredim, the ultra Orthodox, and the idea of a theocracy and the idea of what that would mean for secular Jews, for women, for LGBTQ Jews. How much of that was the kind of the energy provided the energy behind the protests?
Well, I think there's just a lot of different groups with a lot of different energies in this protest, and that's certainly one of the dominant ones. There's really all kinds, and each one takes it to their own personal story. There's the gay rights, there's the women's rights, there's the military reservists, there's the high tech. It's really everybody based on what they have to lose. What are they the most concerned about? And it's interesting because Israel, as opposed to the US, has much more liberal de facto abortion rights, for example, even though on the books it's not as simple as that. But I think that, first of all, it was, kind of a spectacle, the way that they did it. It was something that could really grab attention, and it's been very, very effective. Also, the Israeli flags, for example, which, so many of us on the left are just so horrified by it. But I actually think it's quite smart now that, in retrospect, 3 months later, and it's quite interesting. But I think that there are many, many women who, and not just women, but who feel, and I think this is also the fact that the Palestinians are so excluded from this, is that they're looking at the internal Jewish issues that they deal with. They're looking at what kind of society this is and what they want to have. And you do have very, very, lines that are like fault lines, dividing conflict lines between different Israelis. And one of those big ones are religious versus secular and liberal versus illiberal. And so if you're a woman and you find yourself in a situation where, you may lose some of your rights, then this is the most important thing for you. Whether or not Israel will actually go there, on the books, I don't necessarily think so. But there's a general atmosphere that anything could happen. So, I think women were definitely one of the first ones to start protesting in that sense.
And Orly, I've been following a little bit the debate among people on the left in Israel, people who genuinely do care about the occupation and about apartheid, about whether to stay separate from this or whether to participate in the hope that it could become something different. I know you were saying that you made the decision not to participate in the protest. So I'd love to hear you talk about that and how you made sense of this intra-left debate.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's a very heated debate that is going on and has been going on for 12 weeks in the left, radical left circles. There is the approach that started very effectively, I think, during the Balfour protests, with the establishment of the bloc against the occupation that appeared there regularly and actually succeeded in recruiting some very engaged new activists from the circles of Balfour, people who never had anything to do with anti-occupation protest, and they are until today showing up to every demonstration in the West Bank and accompanying Palestinian shepherds to protect them from settler violence, etc. So that was proven to be very effective in Balfour. But here it's different in two senses. One is that it's much more massive and much more spread out than the Balfour protests. So the occupation bloc, the anti-occupation blocs are there almost in every demonstration today, but they sort of fade away among the huge masses of demonstrators, and as Mairav mentioned, of Israeli flags. So there is the question of efficiency. If it's I mean, if that works to go and voice that message in those demonstrations. But the other thing, and for me that was the crucial point.
Well, I just want to stop for one second. We have a question. Someone asked what the Balfour protests are. Those are referring to the protests about the cost of living or the economic protests.
No.
I'm wrong. You tell me.
What you're talking about, Peter, is the summer of 2011. That was the big protest against the cost of living. Balfour was just a couple of years ago to get rid of Netanyahu because of his indictments.
Right. Because his residence on Balfour Street.
Exactly.
Yeah. My apologies. This is why I'm asking the questions and you're answering them. Go ahead, Orly.
But the second point, or the second reason or difficulty for me with those demonstrations, as Mairav mentioned, I mean, there is the issue of the Israeli flags. If you saw one picture, any pictures, photos from these demonstrations, the thing that catches the eye immediately is the sea of Israeli flags. Now, Mairav is very right that it was a smart move in the sense that the protesters regained ownership over the concept of patriotism, because for so many years, the right wing really delegitimized the center and the left as unpatriotic, un-Israeli, un-Jewish, even in some cases. And all of a sudden, they regained ownership over the flag. And it's very funny how it's symbolized now with the protest movement, to the extent that people with the Israeli flag were not allowed in the Knesset, because now the Israeli flag is a sign of the protest camp. But I think that while it was a very smart move on the tactical level, and it achieved what it aimed to achieve, on the strategical level, it was a disaster, because it completely prevented the Palestinian citizens from participating in these demonstrations. And in the long run, and you know, if we learned one thing in the 75 years of Israel, is that without the presence, active presence of the Palestinian citizens, we cannot progress forward towards real democracy. And so, and this is what I meant by what they really want is bring us the democratic state for the Jews and just forget about the Palestinians. We tried that. We tried that 2 years ago around Balfour, and it was very successful because we got rid of Netanyahu's government. And then there was a new coalition that brought together anti-occupation prominent activists such as Mossi Raz and Gabi Lasky from Meretz, sitting alongside hawkish right-wingers such as Naftali Bennett and Avigdor Lieberman. And you know what happened with that government? Not only it became the deadliest government against Palestinians in the West Bank since 2 decades, and they doubled the number of house demolitions in East Jerusalem and whatnot, but eventually they broke down the government themselves. They dissolved the government themselves to protect the apartheid law in the West Bank. So I think that, you know, participating in a demonstration that at its best can achieve another such government will just take us to another circle, and we'll end up exactly at the same place. There are other ways to fight discrimination and racism and occupation and apartheid, and you know, a lot of us are doing it on a daily basis. I don't feel the need, or I don't feel comfortable enough with that protest to participate.
Mairav,
Can I just add something? Can I
Yeah,
add
please.
something to that?
Yeah.
Well, just I have been to some of the protests, and mostly as a witness. But it's true. I mean, it's very hard to find messages that I identify with. And in the first protest I went to, I took my older child, and people were running in the streets screaming democracy. And I was like, what do they mean? Like, what is this? And it really meant nothing. And I started talking to my son about it because, democracy, again, to him, it doesn't mean anything either. Like he doesn't. So we started in the same place talking about it, which was interesting. But, there is the anti-occupation bloc, and I do think that they are growing. And what I do find inspiring is that I don't recognize almost anyone there. Usually when I go to a protest, I know everybody. So this kind of protest, I'm not recognizing even the leftist in it, which means that A, I'm getting older, but B, that a lot of younger people are coming out, and that's a very good thing. And there are a lot of cracks being opened. But I definitely heard people, when you see, there's some signs that are either you can't have democracy without occupation, or democracy for everyone, which is a much better message than just democracy. And I heard Israelis, saying like they shouldn't be here. This isn't the right messaging. That was more in the beginning. Now it's a little maybe different, but it was so interesting to see how difficult it was for them to accept that kind of messaging. And the fact that that messaging continues to press on is important.
Yes. Well, words are very malleable. I mean, both sides in the Civil War fought under the banner of freedom, Mairav, I wanted to stick with you to a question we have in the chat, which really has to do with what you think the next steps are for this government. Do you think that it's going to, after this break for the Passover break that the Knesset is on, it's that they're going to go and make a big push for this again? Is it remain, you think, kind of central to the agenda, or do you think it's now reached a point where they may move on to other things? And how much danger do you think the coalition government is of falling apart if they can't get this done?
So I hate that question because I really have no idea what's going to happen. But I'll say a few things. I mean, I think that we're already in a constitutional crisis. Like, I also get a question a lot, like, is the third intifada happening? It's like, no, but also maybe yes. Like, maybe this isn't. Maybe this is a third intifada, and this is what it looks like because Israel has decimated the Palestinians so much that this is what it looks like, and they can't organize. But I mean, that's a separate issue. But on the constitutional crisis, I mean, you have members of government saying to the Attorney General and saying to the Supreme, like inciting against the Supreme Court president and saying, we don't care what you say, we're not going to listen to you. I mean, obviously there's different steps and degrees of that, but to me, that's already a constitutional crisis. So now the main question is what Netanyahu is going to do to finagle his survival. And if his survival means not passing it, then he won't pass it. If it means, the opposite, then he'll do that. So, and I think nobody knows what's going on in his head. There's a lot of theories on what's happening and who's making the decisions. I definitely don't know. But I can tell you that it's not looking good. And, in the bigger scheme of things, whether or not Ben Gvir gets this supposed militia or not, which I think is going to be very difficult for him to actually get. We already have de facto militias on the ground, right? And they're already getting emboldened and legitimized. And whether this judicial...
Just explain that a little bit for people who might... What militias are you talking about?
So when the coalition was formed, Ben Gvir demanded, as national security minister over the police, he also demanded to create a kind of national guard, which wouldn't be, for people who actually went through police training the same way that police do, would be some kind of force inside Israel, 1948 Israel, not in the West Bank, to kind of police Arab Jewish cities like Lod, Lida, and other places where there were eruptions of violence in May 2021. He campaigned on this issue of returning governance and security to Jewish Israelis. And so he wants to create some kind of civilian private militia of some sort that literally have the same authorities as police, but are subject to him and not to a police commander or somebody else. And so this is very, very concerning. But again, I think there's a lot of legal hurdles to whether he'll get that. Now, when Netanyahu was silent all day after the protest came out, after he fired his defense minister, Ben-Gvir apparently got him to sign again the same commitment to form this National Guard. Now, again, I don't know if it'll happen, but if a prime minister is saying to a guy who's been convicted of terror, hey, I'll give it to you, then that's it. That's already, the damage is already done, right? Like, I mean, obviously, again, there's degrees of damage, but so that's the issue with the militias. So we have a lot of de facto scary things already happening. And in Israel in general, the way that Israel has always operated, build a settlement and then legalize it. So they build these things and later they'll legalize it, right? That's, I think, what's happening here. And, again, I don't know what's going to happen, but everybody in the government seems intent on still passing these reforms. And they're not reforms, but whatever you want to call them. And Netanyahu wants to survive. And he also wants to leave a legacy. That's very important for him. Now, I don't know how he's going to normalize relations with Saudi or do other things while he has this happening. So I don't know what his strategy is, but I think we're already in a crisis, and it's not looking good as far as how this, the streets, now that the right wing is organizing, the streets are very tense. You can really feel the tension. And even though they might be outnumbered, they're very, very angry, and they feel like they're not being represented. They feel like we won the election. We want to do whatever we want. And so the situation, the fog of war here is getting very thick.
If I can just
Go ahead,
add
please.
one thing to that, just to continue on Meirav's last comment. Now the new thing is that the right-wingers are going to protest, the supporters of Netanyahu and that government are going to protest with signs that say second-class citizens. that's the new thing. They are, and I think that we should really look carefully into that narrative of victimhood that Netanyahu is promoting very viciously right now, because it's not nothing he does is unintentional, or everything has a purpose. And I think that the purpose is to cool down the protests by, the promise of dialogue and conversation and whatnot. Wait until after Pesach, and then we are reaching the national days in Israel.
Memorial and
the Memorial Day, and then the Independence Day, and those are the days that we all come together, and there is a big national hug between everybody. And after that, my guess is that he will go full force in promoting those legislations, and if there is a sign of protest from the other side, he will use the card of victimhood, saying we agreed to some concessions. You are, and he will turn the blame to the other side, and it might really get to a point that they will pass those legislations, which will be ruled out by the Supreme Court, and then we will be in a very strange situation in which the government will conduct under laws that the Supreme Court ruled out as illegal. And what happens then? I mean, it's anybody's guess, basically.
Orly, I wanted to pick up on what you said about the notion of second-class citizens, and we have a question by Matthew in the chat, which also gets to this as well. As the majority, I think, of Likud voters are Mizrahi, right? And I know that there some of the critiques of these protests have claimed that these were the elite of society. There was that claim about the glint from the Rolex watches was the light that was shining. So how much of this language of victimhood of second-class citizens is the right, which, weaponizing deeper resentments among Mizrahi Jews towards a traditional Ashkenazi elite?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know necessarily that the majority of Likud voters are Mizrahim. There is I think that the Likud wants to present it that way. I'm not sure it's necessarily true, but let's say it is. This is one of the most cynical manipulations by that government, and especially by Netanyahu, trying to present themselves as the protectors and as the representatives of what we refer to in the Israeli discourse as the second Israel, as opposed to the first elitist Israel, i.e. the Mizrahim. First, I mean, we should remember that while the Labour Party has already had 4 Mizrahi chairs, the Likud, the so-called Mizrahi Likud, has never had a Mizrahi head. I mean, there was never a Mizrahi chair for the Likud party. But to really understand how cynical that claim is, we should look into the other articles of legislation that they want to promote. I mean, this is probably the most anti-Mizrahi government we've ever had. It's not, I mean, understandably so, the public discourse is focusing on the judicial articles of their agenda. But when you look at the entirety of the agenda of this government, you see it's anti-social, anti-poor people, anti-women, and anti-Mizrahi. And let's just a few, the war that they're waging against public housing. This is a direct strike on so many Mizrahi communities that after decades cannot still have a secure roof over their head. It's a very radical neoliberal agenda. So they are full power for the privatization of the educational system, which is already, I mean, the educational system in Israel is already leading the West world with the gap between the achievements of children based on the socioeconomic status of their parents. It means basically that, you know, Mizrahi kids success less because the state invests very, very little in the periphery, in the education. So further privatizing the educational system is just means duplicating the socioeconomic gaps into the next generation and the one after that. And the list really goes on and on. So they are using, but you know what gives them what allows them or allows that manipulation to be successful to a great extent is the fact that the old regime before that new elite was also very bad for the Mizrahim. So the claim for underrepresentation or no representation in many cases of Mizrahim in the Supreme Court, in basically except for the military and any other elitist circles, is absolutely right. There is an underrepresentation of Mizrahim in those circles, but certainly it's not going to be Netanyahu's government. And look at that will promote Mizrahim to those places, and just look who is leading that judicial coup. It's Netanyahu, it's Yariv Levin, it's Simcha Rothman, it's Smotrich, all from the Ashkenazi elite. So the fact that they're speaking on behalf of Mizrahim is just really pure outrageous.
I want to go to Mairav, but I just have to follow up just briefly, but then explain Shas's role in this coalition, right? Because it is in the coalition. It is obviously a Sephardi Mizrahi religious party, which as I understand it, has historically been more concerned with, you know, not as neoliberal, not as capitalist in its economic views because of its constituents. So how are they comfortably part of this coalition then? Orly, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no. Shas has a very notorious record of anti-social voting. I mean, they are not there. They voted. They have a very, very bad record of voting for laws that affected very, very severely the Mizrahi communities, the poorer communities, the more marginalized communities. They are regularly voting for the interests of the wealth and the rich, but they give a sense of identity or communal identity, which in the Israeli very polarized political sphere has it's powerful. Even the fact that people just see people who look like themselves in the government and gives us, because you know, when you're deprived of so much, then clinging to that sense of identity very often remains the only thing that you're left with. So at least, you know, we see our people in there. Are they taking care of us? No, they don't. Really, they don't. They do take care of the people inside their system. And Shas has its own educational system and its own welfare system. And whoever goes through that system gets parts of the resources. But the general Mizrahi communities, Shas couldn't care less.
Mairav, I wanted to ask you about something else. So I think one of the interesting things in the last few days since Biden made these somewhat critical comments is what seems to have been this kind of conversation on the Israeli right or the far right, which imagines the US as the enemy. It declares that America needs to leave Israel alone, right? Which is, of course, somewhat ironic since I assume they don't want America to stop giving $3.8 billion, and almost sounds like Putin and some of these other regimes in talking about how America is creating a color revolution in their country. It's quite, so tell me, like, help me understand this discourse. And do you think that has that kind of discourse on the Israeli right, that kind of anti-American discourse, has any longer term significance?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, the right is kind of split into two, okay? So there's the hardcore ideological right that is saying all these things, and they're like the populist right. They're the, you know, a parallel to the populism and the Trumpism that we see in the US. They are like they're the anarchists, right? They're anti-establishment, they're anti-army. And they've been inciting against the security establishment. The security establishment has been completely anti-Netanyahu. I mean, he's like persona non grata in every single security brass now. It's quite amazing. And Netanyahu is kind of just playing both lines. So, you know, I mean, this is what they do. They play up this rhetoric and they play to a base that seems to like it. It's not, you know, anchored in any kind of reality. And then if you ask anybody on the practical right, and this is mostly the military types and the security types, the US is the most important thing for Israel to continue its regime the way that it stands now. So you have this kind of split, and you know, it's funny because it's like we're in this crisis. The US, you know, Biden said he's not inviting Netanyahu, and now we're in this crisis. I mean, on the one hand, no, we're not in a crisis because the US has yet to do anything of any kind of substance. But on the other hand, it is de facto boycotting this administration. I mean, you could look at it that way. So it's a very interesting, you know, dynamic that we've never seen before. You know, and the thing about the way that populism works in the US is that it has many, many pockets that can succeed and have succeeded in the Republican Party. But here, that kind of populism that is like detached from the reality of occupation and war and all these things can't actually function because the military here is so strong, and they want, you know, when you had the former Shin Bet guy talking, Nadav Argaman, he worked with Netanyahu up until June 2021. He had this huge exclusive interview. He never talks to the media. And he basically was saying, we need to keep a democracy in order to continue occupation and apartheid. Like, we need it. Don't you understand? We need it. And all these far rightists are blowing up our spot. I mean, that's the discourse. So, you know, most people, including Netanyahu, understand that they need the US. And it's not just the 3.8 billion. It's all the political and it's everything.
Yes.
So, yeah.
And I actually wanted to follow up on that particular. How much do you think the military's opposition to Netanyahu's judicial reforms, and even these prominent people, reservists not being willing, saying we're not going to serve, was prompted by their fears that this would make it easier to bring Israel in front of the International Criminal Court because they would have less of a fig leaf, because if the Supreme Court was seen to be toothless.
100%. I mean, that's a huge concern, but it's also just their own like self-serving consciousness. They want to feel good about themselves. They want to feel okay about what they're doing. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't a spectrum of people who have, different views on this, but, this is the first time that we've had a real like threat of a mass refusnik, movement in Israel. The small refusnik movement against the occupation has never reached these levels. And you have to wonder why it is that bombing Gaza in, a mass scale is not a reason to stop and think about what you're doing, but this is. And so it's, again, like I don't want to take away from the power of what they're doing and why it might be very, very difficult for them to do that. But it's very clear where the fault lines are here, and they want to continue. And this is what the U.S. wants as well. We want Israel to maintain an image of a nice liberal democratic place that doesn't do, explicitly horrible things, or even more explicitly horrible things than it already does. So they want to retain this image of themselves that they will only function in a rule of law society. Now, I mean, I took apart that notion in a recent article of mine because the rule of law has always been bent in Israel to serve its agenda. So they need to really like think about what that means to them. But the refusnik movement here, is, the threat of it, it's now, I think, in abeyance because of what's happening, but that's very, very powerful. And it could go very far as both the right and the left, how they end up responding to different policies in the future. So it's an interesting phenomenon.
And if
Go
I
ahead,
can
Orly,
just
please.
one thing to that, I mean, it gets to such a surreal places. What you asked about the role of the Supreme Court in protecting Israel and Israeli soldiers and other senior figures from being brought before the international court. One of the rules, one of the bills that the laws that Ben-Gvir really pushes for is a complete immunity for soldiers so that they cannot be brought to justice. They cannot be persecuted for anything that they did in their capacity as soldiers. Right. It's in a way, it's a very strange situation in which human rights organizations say, bring it on. I mean, because that will be the thing that will maybe persuade the international community that the Israeli judicial system cannot and does not want to deal with by itself. And I think that from that point of view, it's a very welcome almost law, because those soldiers who are being persecuted in the very, very rare cases that it even happens, no convictions almost ever achieved. So in the bottom line, nothing will change, but at least the pretense will I mean, the mask will fall, and then it will be easier to actually show the Israeli regime for what it really is.
I wanted to ask just a version of that question. You are a member of Balad. I think you were on the Balad list for the last election. So for folks who don't know, Balad is a mostly Palestinian-led political party that believes in Israel being a state for all of its citizens. From the sense of you're getting from the conversations in Balad, given these two alternatives, right? A successful return to the status quo pre-Bibi, the security establishment status quo, or this very frightening, out of control kind of right-wing government that could undermine Israel's, perhaps accelerate trends in the West towards sanctioning Israel. What is the conversation within Balad like about those two, both very scary options?
Well, I think that, as you can imagine, no option is very appealing. I mean, certainly, here people tend to ask repeatedly, where are the Palestinians in the protest? Why are they not protesting? Do they not understand how dangerous the situation is? Well, the Palestinians do understand, and they are more exposed to the dangers of that situation than anybody else, than any other community. But they know that they weren't, they know better than anybody also that they weren't, and none of us really lived in a democracy before. So as far as Balad is concerned, it is absolutely clear we do not want to go back to the old order of things. That also has been an oppressive one, a discriminatory one. But we think that there is a third option, which is right now at this very specific, very rare moment, something positive can actually come of it. And this is the public discourse about what democracy really is. And I think that Balad very bravely has been holding the concept of true democracy, which in Israel sounds like something very, very radical, but this is really the basis of any functioning democracy in the Western world, as a state for all its citizens. So against all the attacks and all the delegitimization, Balad has been holding the idea of a true democracy for all the citizens of the state. And I think that this could be the shining moment for Balad to actually step up and say, look, you want democracy, and that's a good thing. It's a good instinct that you're uprising to demand democracy. But now you should listen really carefully to what democracy really means. And I hope that, that would be a moment that something in the Jewish mind, the Jewish Israeli mind, would open up to understand that we cannot return to that cycle once again. We need to change that because we got here inevitably. And if we don't go for full democracy, we will inevitably return to the same point again.
Mairav, I'm going to give you the last word because we're going to end a couple of minutes early, but I wanted to end on that last critically important point, which is the Jewish Israeli mind, or the kind of and which of course also is related in many ways to the kind of diaspora Jewish mind. They're different minds, but there is a kind of dominant way in which these kind of conversations play out. What do you think? What do you think it would take to allow Israeli Jews who are now in the political center to undergo this cognitive shift, to move outside of a Jewish supremacist framework and to start actually applying these basic principles that they talk about democracy, about equality, to their Palestinian neighbors? Like, what would it take for that flip to switch? I ask this to you partly because you are an Israeli Jew. You grew up in that society. You lived your whole life in that society. You have done that. So, and many of your friends have, right? So what makes it possible?
So I'll just correct you. I actually grew up in New York going to private Jewish Orthodox schools with an Israeli mother and coming to Israel with all my family here. So I got indoctrinated on both sides.
Okay, right. I know the school you're talking about, not necessarily that much better on this count.
Yeah. So Orly can talk about, the purely Israeli perspective, although she wasn't even born here either. But anyway, I think it's a combination of factors, and it would also primarily have to happen in the education system, which is far, far off. But, if Jewish Israelis start getting shot at in high numbers, which I don't think is going to happen, but that's one of the scenarios that I've always said would start to change things. And they are starting to get a taste of it a little bit, very little, but in Tel Aviv, in places like Tel Aviv, if they're shot at the way that Palestinians are shot at, that will start to change things. If Israelis go more to the West Bank, which they don't, in fact, most liberal Zionists who are anti-occupation never step foot in the West Bank at all. They don't know anything about what goes on there. If they did, I think that would also start to change things. And if the course of this government continues in this way, and Israelis start to feel it when they travel abroad, which some already do, I'm sure. When you say you're Israeli, some people are like, oh. If they start to feel it in their pockets, if they feel it when they travel, I'm talking specifically if this government, is considered by the world not to be democratic anymore, then they will realize, they will have to start realizing and putting together the pieces. I really don't understand how more people aren't saying, how is it possible that the same regime that holds people for so long with no rights, how could they not do that to me too? I mean, I wrote about this in 2014. It's like, if you do this to one type of person for so long, it's going to happen to you as well. I mean, people have been saying this, and there's actually one of the greatest messages of the anti-occupation bloc is, I don't know if it's a Martin Luther King quote or it's probably a famous quote, but, none of us are free until all of us are free. This is, something that hopefully more and more Israelis it'll start to, but that they're going to have to suffer a little bit. They're going to have to suffer. Without suffering, and Israel has acted with impunity for so long that, that's something that might take a long, long time. Orly, please.
Do you want to offer a last word, Orly?
I agree with every word with Mairav, and just add international pressure. I mean, once the international community will hold up Israel to the same moral standards that it holds the other members of that club, when they start giving up to those accusations of anti-Semitism every time you criticize Israel, and understand that actually exempting Israel from holding up to those moral stands is a form of anti-Semitism by itself. Because if you say that Jews as a collective cannot simply, hold to those moral codes, then this is a form of anti-Semitism. When the world will start demanding Israel to keep the values, the shared values of true democracy, equality, justice, then and have implications about how they treat the Israeli government if it violates those moral codes and those values, then maybe the Israelis will understand that something needs to change.
Well, on that note, Mairav and Orly, thank you so much. For those of us who regular participants in these Friday calls, we're not going to be having one next week. It'll be the Jewish holiday, so we'll take a week off. But we're very, very grateful to all of you for participating, and Orly and Mairav, you were just fabulous. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Peter.
Thank you very much.